experimenters, Taylor Ellwood here, and tonight's video is a atypical one. I normally focus on a specific topic, but I was asked, one of the video requests that I was asked is like, what are my favorite books and what books am I reading right now? And I thought, you know what, it's kind of interesting. Why not talk about that? I should say first off that I really don't have any favorite books per se, and you might be surprised by that. I mean, Taylor, you're reading all the time. Why wouldn't you have favorite books? And my answer to that would be that yes, I am reading all the time, and that's probably the reason why I don't have favorite books, because I'm always reading something new. I mean, I guess there's a few books I really like. Like I love I get okay. We'll revise that. I do love I love Watership Down. That's a book I'll read again and again and again. And I just finished reading The Soul Forge, which actually, when I think about it, is a favorite book of mine. But in general, I don't know that I have tons of favorite books. And again, it's not something that I really actively think about. I mean, they're just I like reading all the time, and I'm on to reading new things. So with that said, let's talk about the stuff that I'm reading right now, because it is interesting. So I'm reading a number of different books, and I'm going to share them with you. I'm going to pull some over from the one bookshelf. I read multiple books, so keep that in mind. So let's see here. I am working my way through The Four Dragons, which is a book on Neigong. I'm actually learning, in this case, a specific practice called Tao Yin, which is a Taoist practice where you're basically getting rid of the negative qi through the movements that you're doing. I'm currently working on just mastering 2 of the movements. There's some more, so that book is a little bit at a standstill. I'm also reading Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein, which is a really fascinating book that takes a look at economics and money from a different perspective. I mean, he's definitely not a capitalist and doesn't necessarily agree with the way capitalism approaches things. So, fair enough. I don't know that I necessarily agree with him completely, but at the same time, I see his point, and I think, it's always good to look at our relationship with money in different ways. I'm reading Taoist Sexual Meditation by Bruce Francis, which is all about Taoist sexual practices. And, I always find anything to do with the body fascinating. I like learning about it. I like discovering what the human body can do. And I extend that, of course, to sex. So, hey, why not become better at it, right? I don't really even necessarily look at it in that way, but it's more about the fact that there's some very interesting things you can do with Taoist techniques when it comes to sex, in terms of dissolving blockages and things like that, and how you can help your partner out. So I'm curious to see what his take is. He's already written about some of it in his other books. And then I'm reading Sacred Architecture, which is a book all about different types of sacred temples and how they're organized and set up spatially and how people worship in them. Now, that's not all I'm reading. Let's see here. I'm also reading, look at this doorstopper, XMen, The Age of Apocalypse Companion, because I love comic books, and The Age of Apocalypse was one of my favorites. And I'm also reading The Age of Apocalypse, yes. So I love comic books, and I'm usually got my head buried in one of those at one time or another because I find them to be fascinating. I love the graphical nature of the storytelling. But that's not all. I'm also reading Mastering Amazon Ads, because as an author, I'm trying to make sure that, I sell books. And part of that is through the advertising I do on Amazon. I find it to be pretty helpful. And let's continue on. I'm also reading Brothers in Arms, which is a book. It's the sequel to The Soul Forge. It's kind of the further adventures of Raistlin and Caraman before the War of the Lance. And there's some very interesting magical lessons in there, so you're probably going to see me post a follow-up post to a blog post I wrote recently after I finished reading the book. I'm reading The Slight Edge. I love business books, and this is one I actually highly recommend to any of you who are out there who really are just serious about improving your life overall, because you're going to find that The Slight Edge does exactly that. It has some very interesting ideas, and it really gets you to look at your relationship with yourself. I'm also reading The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli, who is a scientist. I find his stuff on physics really interesting, and of course, I'm always researching stuff for space-time magic. I'm reading The Way We Think, which is conceptual blending in the mind's hidden complexities, which really just explores how people think in this case, and how they use that thinking to come up with different information, design, things like that. It's a really fascinating book. And let's see here. Oh, a few more I'm reading. I'm reading Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, which is all about how people set up situations in order to persuade people to, for a number of things, whether it's buying stuff or going on a date or whatever else. It's again fascinating stuff. He approaches it from an ethical perspective, which I really appreciate, because he's like I don't want, I'm trying to make people aware of how people manipulate others sometimes. So I think that's cool. Effortless Living by Jason Gregory, which is a book about Wu Wei and Taoism, and again, very interesting. I think that what I find interesting about it is that it kind of is getting me to look at my magical practice and think to myself, like, what do I agree with this guy or not? And I don't know. It's interesting, though. Makes me think. And I'm reading the Spirit Cord by R.J. Stewart, who is my magical mentor and teacher, and one of the most fascinating people I know. And also, on my Kindle, I am reading, let me just pull it up here, if I can. I'm reading Serpent's Return, a superhero's urban fantasy. So as you can probably tell, I read a lot of different books, and you might wonder, like, how do you get through all those books? And the answer is I get through them slowly. I mean, I'll read a chunk of them at a time and then kind of move on to the next book. And it takes some time. I like it that way, though. I like reading different books. It kind of gives me time to think about them and process. And it's just the way that it's just the way I process information at this point. I think there was a time where I used to be able to just read one book at a time, but I can't do that anymore. I actually find it to be far too linear. And I'm a nonlinear thinker in a lot of ways. And so that's where that's at. As you might notice, all these different books that I read, most of them aren't magical books. In fact, it's pretty much only one of them is really an occult magic book, and that's the Spirit Cord. I mean, we could argue that the Taoist sexual meditation and the Four Dragons and the book on Wu Wei I mean, you could kind of fuzz that in there and say they are. I mean, they're definitely about spiritual topics, but for the most part, most of the stuff I read has nothing to do with the occult on the obvious level. And in the case of like the Amazon ads, this is really all about me just learning the business of being a successful writer. Continuing to refine my approach to writing and everything else. So that certainly plays a factor or a role in the work that I'm doing. But with a lot of these books that I read, like the book on sacred architecture, I'm reading it partially for inspiration for the fiction books that I'm writing, but partially because I just find the idea of how people design space to be absolutely intriguing. I mean, I'm actually in the process of this long-term work where I'm literally shaping my physical space, not my physical shape. Well, I am, I exercise every day, but my literal physical space, to make it into a ritual temple. So, that's kind of its own thing right there, and that's something that's a long-term work in and of itself. That's also part of the magical work that I'm doing. And the comic books I read because, well, I just love superhero stories and stuff. I love superhero fiction. I'm a huge nerd when it comes to superhero stuff. So there, I have no problem admitting it. It's played a role in my pop culture magic work as well. But like the business books, I read those because I try to understand human behavior better, but also because I do see certain extensions of it toward magical stuff and how I set up magical workings to include, the human variable and planning for it and anticipating it. You know, I think for me, that's like a huge important part of magical work for me is that I try to take a look at the stuff that isn't factored into magic and actually make it a part of magic. And it's the same thing with the book on physics. I'm fascinated with space-time stuff. So that's what I'm reading right now, and that's a little bit about my approach to reading and everything else. I can guarantee you that pretty much all of the books that I'm reading will, in one form or another, inform my magical work at some point, because they always do, or they have in the past. And it's just the way that I think about things. Like, I'm always asking myself at the back of my mind, how can I apply this to magic? How could this change my approach to magical work? So that's it for tonight. Again, an atypical video, but I thought, hey, why not indulge this person and myself and talk about that? See you next week, and take care.